Hey everyone, it's Amber. I am here today to work on my Queen of Hearts. So my current goal is to create an art series for Alice in Wonderland. I love Alice in Wonderland. I always have. I collect all kinds of things that have to do with it. Been meaning to incorporate it into my art for a long time, and recently finally started getting some real solid idea of how I wanted to go about that from an artwork perspective, and also hoping to then take the artwork and manipulate it digitally to create some downloadable printable content for use in things like junk journals. So for some reason, I've started with the Queen instead of Alice. I think I'm just kind of vibing with the Queen more at this particular moment. And I've already got the first couple layers of this art piece started. So I'll go over what I've done already, and then we're gonna work on her a little bit more today. So something I really enjoy doing right now from a mixed media art perspective is working on this sort of collage background. And all I really do, I take some matte medium like this Liquitex matte gel or some other type of matte gel or matte medium. And I rip up pieces of paper. This is a mix of book paper, some foundation paper piecing, quilt pattern, and various scrap papers. And I cover my entire surface with it and just get a nice good layer. I really like the texture that I get from that, this sort of color variation. And then once that's dried, I go over it usually with something like white gesso. But other flat acrylic media would work too. I actually, for this one, I picked this up on sale at one point and decided I wanted to play with it a little bit because it looked like it would produce a nice flat acrylic finish, and it does. So this is Folk Art Home Decor Chalk Paint. And this is the white Adirondack color. And with that, I just apply it with something like, trying to find the knife I used. Here it is, with this particular palette knife. But I have a variety of palette knives with some different edges and textures on them. And you can see this is how I created the lines and stuff here. And I just put this nice thin layer. I want to see a little bit of the collage peeking through in the background. I don't want to lose that, but I want to sort of create a more harmonious surface and push some of that collage back, so that I have something a little bit more cohesive to start with. For my Queen here, I have been doing an awful lot, excuse me while I try and find it, an awful lot of drawing lately, or sketching my initial sketch, excuse me, using these Derwent graph tint pencils. And I'm trying to find, oh, I set her aside in a separate bucket. That's why I can't find the one I'm looking for. Here we go. These Derwent graph tint pencils are wonderful. They're water soluble. They create these nice graphite type lines because they're basically just tinted graphite. And then I went over it with a water brush and just blended some of that out. And what's fun about these is instead of using a pencil where I'm going to have lines I'm trying to like erase or hide, this is actually going to be part of the art piece. So it doesn't matter that the lines show up. So it gives me the opportunity to sort of sketch something out a little imperfectly. You can see I made the size of her hair a couple of times, so there's more than one line buried in there, but because they're water soluble, I can soften those lines and bring it into the finished piece rather than having to erase it out or cover it up or see those, you know, regular pencil lines peeking through the finished work. So I started with that, and of course she's the Queen of Hearts, so I went with red, or in this case the color is called Port. The other thing I did, and I don't do this very often with my work, but the other thing I did is I created a sort of palette to work from. This isn't exact because I'm not sticking to just colored pencils, so I'm obviously not going to have these exact colors, but it gives me a way, a sort of a visual reference as I'm working on the different art pieces so that I keep everything in this general palette and I don't run into a situation where the art piece I do for Alice uses a bunch of different colors or hues or tints that don't work with the Queen, and then when you display these side by side or create printables, you have pieces that don't work together. That was my concern, because while I do have certain colors I tend to gravitate towards, I am pretty fluid in the color palettes that I work in, and some days I'm very vibrant and other days I like something that's muted or pastel, and in order to avoid having things that just didn't go together, I wanted to make sure that I had a color palette that I could use as a reference piece. So I started with this Port and another graph tint called Dark Indigo, and that's because when I make a journal from the downloadable printables later, I intend to use a lot of these playing cards. And because I'm going to use these playing cards, I want them to work with the pieces I'm creating as well. And frankly, I don't use a lot of red at all. And I don't use a lot of this kind of like indigo blue. I tend to go for more vibrant or turquoise types of blues. And so this meant that I, again, needed to make sure that I ended up with art pieces that were going to work with this, so a palette was in order. So I used that palette. I used these two graph tint colors as sort of starting places, and then worked to find other colors that I thought would go with it throughout the wheel. So, you know, other shades of red and blue, but then also, you know, what yellow shade am I going to use? What kind of orange, what kind of purples or greens are going to work their way in? You know, I'm also planning to do a lot of garden imagery, and in those cases in particular, I might be tempted to go with something crazy like this fluorescent pink. And if I don't think it's going to work with the palette, that's going to keep me from veering too far away. I'll definitely use colors other than this. I am usually pretty colorful in my work, so it'd be hard to imagine myself limiting. I just want to make sure that everything ultimately talks to one another. So the next step here is to start working in more details on the Queen. For that, I'm going to use some pencils. I pulled out, these are the pencils that made up that palette I just showed you, so I set them all aside. So they'll obviously be first picked when I'm working with pencils, soluble, water soluble or otherwise. But I'm also going to try working with watercolor. A lot of times when I'm at this stage, I work with acrylic, but I'm in a really watercolor sort of mood. I don't know if I'm just in the mood to use this particular set of paints that I have. I love them. They're called Beam paints, and I will put a link to their website in the description box because they are just absolutely fabulous. They're my favorite paints to use, hands down. And I'm just kind of in the mood to play with them. So I'm going to see if I can get them to work on the surface. I think they will. If not, I pulled some acrylics and set them aside and I can use those. And I'm just going to start to work a little bit more. You know, right now she doesn't have any pupils in her eyes, so she looks a little demonic. Obviously, I want to get away from that for the finished piece. Although I do like something about where this is at right now. And one of the beauties of working with the kind of things that we do, because I will sometimes manipulate my art digitally, even if it's just to sort of clean it up for display, I scan pretty much everything. And so I've already gone ahead and scanned her at this stage. You know, if for some reason I end up with a piece I really don't like, this will give me a visual reference if I want to sort of recreate back to this step. It means that I can play around with this stage digitally and potentially create some downloadable printables, ephemera, and other things with her at this stage, in case anybody wants to play around with this version of the queen. So I really like taking breaks in between the different stages of a painting, so that I can come back to it with fresh eyes, and because when it's dry, it gives me the opportunity to scan it at that particular stage if I want. So I'm gonna go ahead and just wet my paints here to activate them. And I'm just using a little spray bottle. I don't remember what this used to hold. It definitely wasn't water, but once it was empty, I just filled it with water, and I keep it handy at my work surface so that I can use it. And so I'm just gonna get everything wet. Another thing I like to do is keep scrap paper handy. And this is so that I can test out colors, wipe away color from my brushes. I often use painted scrap paper once it's pretty well covered, as collage fodder in future work. So I pretty much always have something like that handy. And I'm not going to use this palette. This water. This is the bin I normally use for my acrylic when I am rinsing those brushes off. So I'm going to move my palette further back out of the way. I'm going to get these water vessels here. These are my watercolor jars. I'll get I'm going to go ahead. This is a round brush from the Pigeon Letters. I love it. It's one of my favorite brushes to use, especially for smaller details. And for larger washes, I like these quill mops from Treckle. This is the size 10. So I'm going to go ahead and get that wet too. I'm probably mostly going to use that little round brush, but when it comes to brushes, I often try to work larger, as large as possible. And I'm going to start with her hair with my little quill mop. And I'm using a color, I think this is Violet Mars. It's sort of a red, purple, brown something, but I really like it. And I'm just going to start to work that in for her hair. And it looks like it's not, the watercolor's not working the way it normally would on, say, watercolor paper, but it is working, and it's doing some interesting things where it's pooling, and I really like that. So for the moment, I'm just gonna go with it. There we go. I'm just gonna work this throughout her hair here. Pick up a little bit more color. Really just saturate this through. Try not to cover my work too much with my hand while I'm doing it, but hopefully you can see enough. Get a little bit more on the brush. And I love the quill mops because they just hold so much water and pigment. So they make it easy to cover a larger area pretty quickly. So I get a really sort of uniform coverage. Whereas if I'd used that smaller one, I would have more trouble. So I'm just gonna wipe my excess pigment off over here. And this is why it starts to become a fun surface for collage later, because I often wipe it off before I rinse it so that I don't end up with really, really dirty water. So the water still cleans my brush. There still will be some pigment that'll come out, but it'll take a lot longer for it to get super dirty. There we go. And that's just made testing to make sure I don't have a bunch of pigment left on the brush before I do anything else with it. Let's see here. I think I want to work a little bit wet and pick up some Mars Black. And just before this dries, start dropping that in. Let's get a little bit. I didn't activate that one as well as some of the others. But I want to have that pooling throughout her hair so we get this red and black mix here. Pick up a little bit more water and more pigment and come back through. All right, that is working for me. We're getting, again, the wonder of this collage in the background, and it's adding these extra textured sort of effects that you just wouldn't get on a nice smooth piece of paper. Speaking of paper, this is a Hahnemühle Harmony block. It's a watercolor paper. I really like using this one in particular for mixed media. And I like using the hot press. The surface is super smooth. And that just is really fun to work with when you're using a variety of media, because that means you control the texture. So in this case, I have created my own texture in the background with that collage. I love this. It's all sort of mottled and it's adding more interest to her already. So we're getting that black off. And now I think I'm gonna work on her dress a little before I switch to my smaller brush. So don't have a straight indigo, but I do have this Prussian blue. I can't remember if that's exactly what the name is. Oh, yep, it is. It's on the side of the little paint stone there. That's what they call them. But I think that is going to work with my palette well enough, where it's sort of a darker and more muted blue. Yeah, that's really pretty. And I think we're going to do a red and blue dress to match our playing cards. So I'm just going to start working this in here. I don't want her to be entirely red. Queen of Hearts doesn't have to only wear red. She can have a little fun. So here we go. And again, just a little more water and a little more pigment so that it's not quite so pale down here at the bottom. And it's going to sort of mix in with the red that's already down there. So, you know, I would want to keep that in mind when I'm choosing my colors, because if I chose something on the opposite side of the color wheel, like say green, then I would end up with sort of a muddy color down here and working my way towards probably some sort of shade of brown. So here we go. I like that. I'm gonna add the blue at her waist here as well with my little moppy mop brush. Beautiful. All right, I'm gonna wipe that off here. I should have started with a nice fresh piece of scrap paper. This would be fun to use the the final scrap pieces, scan those and use those as collage fodder in the final background pieces for the downloadables. So I may keep that in mind. All right, gonna grab my smaller round brush here and start thinking about some of the slightly more detailed work. Or actually, you know what? Actually, I've changed my mind. I'm going to keep with the larger brush and do her crown. Now, I'm trying to go for some sort of amber color in the crown or in the yellow that I use. And this yellow is actually fitting that bill pretty well. I wasn't sure if I was gonna want to throw another color in there, but I like the way this looks. And because her hair is still a little bit wet, some of that is bleeding in. I think that looks super cool. Very, very, very happy. All right, so we've got her crown. And with my larger brush, I'm also gonna do her face. Then we can start going in at the detail level. So this color I often use for Caucasian skin tones. And I am Caucasian, so I tend to go towards those colors instinctively. I think a lot of times we do that. I've been playing with other skin tones in some of my work too, and it's been a lot of fun. But a nice Caucasian color if you're working with the beam paints is this Morning Peach that I have. And go ahead and grab that. Sometimes I need to add a little bit of pink to this, but since we've already got this red graph tint pencil, I don't think that's going to be necessary here. So I'm just going to start dropping this in throughout her face. There's a little bit of that black is actually coming in. I'm not going to fight it right now. If it bothers me later, I'll pick some of it up with a paper towel or something and push it back and bring in more peach, but I kind of want to see what happens with it. That's one of the benefits of playing with watercolor here instead of acrylic, is that stuff stays wet longer and it melds more, and I am just really in the mood for that right now. So let's see how it goes. It's a little muddy, but I'm not against it. Grab a Q-tip, pick up some of those sort of blacker, muddier spots. I think we're gonna need to liven up this peach before it's all said and done, but that's one of the nice things about art, is that it's not over until I say it's over. So this is perfectly fine for now. It does not have to end here. In fact, maybe I'll come back through with some pastels or something and adjust her skin tone from there. You can see I had some like hair details drawn on in there, and those have disappeared. They have melted into the water, and that is fine. I can always go back and add them in again later. They were really just fun to play with in the moment during this first phase. All right. So we've added at least the first layer of skin tone. Her crown is leaking into her hair. That's also fine. Again, not the final stage, and adds some interest. So I have no problem with it. And once again, I'm going to go back with this bigger brush. I keep saying I'm going to use the small one, and then I realize there are large areas I want to cover, like parts of her dress that still need some red. Apologize for the barking doggy. I will need to put him on camera at some point, but he is not in the room with me. He just has heard some delivery people outside, and he wants them to know that he is here. If they came in the house, he would wag his tail and beg them to pet him. Alrighty. If you are a pet lover, then you probably want to stay tuned for my channel, just because I have 3 cats and a dog. You will probably hear the dog more than you see him, but the cats do like to jump up in the middle of my painting and startle me and threaten to ruin everything. So I am sure that they will be on camera quite a bit. All right, a little bit more red here. I love the way the blue is mixing in here with the red parts of the dress. I think that's just really interesting. I am not upset about any of it. Okay. At this stage, I think I mostly want to let things dry. I am going to add pupils to her eyes. I'm ready for her to have a little life in there. So I am going to go ahead with my tiny brush finally. Yay, making an appearance here. And we're gonna work those in. And later I will go back through and put some highlights into her eyes so she's got a little bit of sparkle, but she at least no longer looks like a demon. And I figure that's progress. Yeah, so here is where I would normally stop, let things dry, give it some time, and then think about how I want to move forward. I'm probably going to end up adding more color and detail to her over time. Is that going to be with pencil, with additional watercolor, acrylic markers? Who knows? That's part of the fun of working in mixed media. But before I do anything else, I normally stop here, let it dry, put it away, and then come back to it again later. So I don't let things like impatience to be done or anything else put me in a position where I end up overworking her or going in a weird direction that I don't like, or not having an opportunity for layers to dry properly. So this is where we're going to stop. I will share more as she continues to develop and as I work on some of the other characters. I will make a video in the future that shows the base layers for something like this with the collage and the gesso or the paint and some of the initial sketching. So stay tuned for that, as well as the development of our beautiful queen here. And thank you again for joining me.